The sky-bound secret. The morning sky over the runway glowed like a soft lantern, and the private car stopped beside the jet bridge, and the door opened with the quiet click of money in habit, and there stepped out a tall man in a slate suit with the kind of watch people whisper about, and beside him walked his son, holding a backpack to his chest like a shield, and trying to match the pace of his father without looking at the cameras that always seemed to find them. The terminal buzzed with travelers chasing schedules and coffees and small victories, and yet the air changed when the pair entered the gate area, because recognition moves faster than a boarding call, and heads turned and phones tilted, and the whispers spread like perfume in a crowded room, and the whisper said, "That is the man who builds cities with a signature, and that is his boy who never stays long in any one place, and who always looks like he is searching for a door no one else can see." The agent at the counter straightened with a practiced smile, and the crew by the door exchanged quick looks the way a team does when something special walks in, and one of them, a young woman with warm eyes and steady hands, adjusted her name tag and slowed her breathing, as if she already felt a storm that had not yet touched the wing, and she watched the boy, not the suit, and she saw how his fingers curled tight around the strap of his backpack, and how he counted in a rhythm only he understood, and how the big world pressed too close around him even though he was surrounded by empty spaces. Boarding began with the usual calls, and the first-class cabin welcomed them with hush and velvet, and the smell of citrus and leather, and the father nodded a thank you to no one in particular, and led his son to the seats at the front, where the aisle felt wide enough to breathe, and the overhead lights glowed like a quiet promise, and still the boy flinched when a trolley rolled by with metal singing against metal, and he squeezed his eyes and counted faster, and the father patted his shoulder with a gentle tap that said, "You are safe," but the boy's breath stayed shallow, like a bird at a window across the aisle. A woman in a red scarf adjusted her earbuds and stole a glance, and a businessman lifted his newspaper that he would not read, and a pair of teenagers compared boarding passes while pretending not to record, and the air filled with little judgments as light as dust and just as hard to clean, and the attendant with the steady hands noticed more than the glances, because she noticed the pattern of the boy's rocking and the way he traced a shape on his knee, the outline of a circle that was not quite a circle, and the way his gaze kept jumping to the exit signs as if they were distant lighthouses, and she thought, "I have seen this sea before." The father leaned in and spoke softly, and the words were like stepping stones across a stream. "Hold on, son, we will be in the sky soon. Hold on." And the boy nodded once, twice, and opened his backpack just enough to touch a small object wrapped in cloth, a smooth puzzle sphere with shifting pieces, and he rolled one segment under his thumb, and the click soothed him, and he looked out the window at the wing that waited like a patient animal, and he whispered the numbers of a countdown with no rocket at the end. Announcements floated through the cabin like music, and the door closed with the soft thud of no turning back, and the taxi began, and the engines woke from sleep, and their hum rose in a steady climb, and the floor trembled, and the boy's body answered the tremble with a tremble of its own, and the father checked the belt again and asked if he wanted water, and the boy shook his head and pressed the puzzle sphere to his forehead as if it could cool a fever, and the attendant watched from the galley and nodded to herself, and she collected a small blanket and a pair of noise-reducing headsets and a paper card with soft edges and a pen, and slid them into her apron, ready for a choice that might arrive without warning. As the jet lifted and the city fell away like a memory, the boy's eyes widened at the sudden press of the climb, and his breath caught, and the sound in his throat grew tight and thin, and he rocked faster, and the puzzle sphere slipped from his hand and rolled under the seat where shadows keep secrets, and he reached for it with a small desperate sound that pierced through the careful luxury, and the father reached too late, and the boy's fingers scraped carpet with nothing to hold, and his shoulders locked, and the cabin air felt like it had lost its oxygen. The businessman folded his newspaper with a sigh, as if the sound itself were an inconvenience, and the woman in the red scarf tugged her earbuds, as if music could be armor, and the teenagers exchanged a look that hummed with the thrill of drama, and the father raised a hand to ask for help, and the attendant with the steady hands was already moving, and she knelt quietly by the boy's seat, and her voice came low and even like a harbor in fog, and she asked, "May I sit here for a moment?" And the father nodded with a gratitude that looked like relief and fear braided together. She did not touch the boy, because she saw how touch could be a spark, and she kept a respectful distance, and she lowered her gaze so he would not feel trapped, and she placed the little paper card on the armrest with the pen. She drew a slow spiral that widened like a breath, and she drew it again and again, and her own breathing matched the curve, and she said, in a voice gentle as cloth, "We can draw the sky together, if that feels good," and the boy's eyes flicked to the spiral, and then to her hands, and his rocking slowed by one small measure that only people who watch closely would notice. The father whispered. He dropped his puzzle, and she answered, "I will help you find it, and first we will help his body feel safe," and she took the blanket and rolled it into a small cylinder, and placed it where his feet could push against it, and she said, "You can press as hard as you want, and no one will mind, and you are strong and safe." And the boy pushed, and the pressure gave his muscles a path, and the path gave his breath a rhythm, and the rhythm gave the moment a tiny doorway, and through that doorway stepped a fragile quiet that could grow, if protected. The engines kept their steady him, and clouds slid by like quiet witnesses, and the cabin light softened, and the attendant unfolded the headsets and held them where the boy could see, and she tapped the side once, twice, in the same pattern as his earlier counting, and she asked, "Do you want to try these?" And she did not try to place them on his head, because choice was the rope that could pull him back, and after a long second the boy reached and took them and pressed them to his ears, and the world fell into a muffled hush, and his shoulders dropped half an inch, and that half inch felt like a mile to the father. The businessman looked away because the scene no longer fed his irritation, and the woman in the red scarf found herself breathing in time with the boy, without meaning to, and the teenagers lowered their phones just a little, and in the galley a second attendant peeked out with curiosity and found none of the spectacle he had expected. Only a young colleague making a soft world inside a loud one, and guiding a frightened traveler across it. The father whispered thank you with eyes that shone like someone who has not slept through a night in years, and the attendant nodded and asked if there was anything that always helps him when things get too big, and the father said, "The puzzle sphere, it is like an anchor," and she smiled and said, "Anchors are good, we will bring it back," and she turned her head, and her gaze swept the floor with a calm intensity, and she reached under the seat where the shadow had swallowed the sphere, and she felt nothing, and then the rough edge of the safety card, and then a glimmer of smooth metal, and she closed her fingers around the shape that felt familiar to hands trained to rescue small lost things. She lifted the sphere into the light, and the boy's eyes followed it like a planet finding its sun, and she did not give it at once because ritual matters, and she held it still and said, "We will pass the star to the captain of breathing, and then to you, ready," and she placed it first on the armrest as if crowning a step in a ceremony, and then into the father's palm, and then the father placed it in the boy's hands, and the boy's fingers shaped themselves to the puzzle and rotated a single plate that clicked into place with the soft sound of relief, and he exhaled, and the breath seemed to sweep dust from the air. The attendant stayed beside him, without hovering, and she drew another spiral on the card, and then a simple map with a dot for the plane and a curve for the path, and she said, "We are here, and the sky is wide, and you are safe," and the boy traced the curve with the pen and wrote a small number near the pat, and then another, and the numbers climbed like steps, and each step matched a turn of the puzzle, and each turn matched a deeper breath, and the father watched with a gratitude that realigned his entire face, as if a mask had slipped, and the person beneath had finally come up for air around them. The flight settled into the quiet after takeoff, when people choose movies and naps and daydreams, and yet a new kind of attention held the cabin, a gentle attention that noticed without judging and listened without leaning in too close, and the attendant felt it and knew that moods travel faster than carts, and that kindness changes the air the way a storm does, but without the damage, and she was proud in a way that did not need applause, and she thought of the long road that had taught her to see what others miss, and to move slowly in a world that worships speed. The boy looked up and glanced at the window and the blue beyond, and then at her, and his lips moved without sound first, and then shaped a quiet question. "Will there be thunder?" And she said, "There may be a little, but we can make a tent of calm, and we can ride inside it." And he nodded and pressed his feet into the rolled blanket again, and tested the strength of his tent, and the father brushed a strand of hair from his son's forehead, and did not speak, because words would have spilled his heart across the aisle or far. Behind them in coach, a baby cried and was comforted, and a luggage bin squeaked and latched, and a coffee machine hissed its little storm, and the plane moved forward through hidden rivers of air, and yet at the front row a new balance held firm like a bridge, and the attendant rose slowly and asked the father if he needed a moment to breathe too, and he laughed softly in that way people do when kindness catches them unprepared, and said, "I think I do," and she handed him water, and he drank, and the sound of the ice in the cup felt like a tiny bell calling him back to himself. When she stepped back, the boy turned the sphere again and again, and the pattern of his movements softened until it looked less like panic and more like music, and the father watched, and the passengers settled, and the world inside the cabin found a steady pulse, and yet a question hovered like a small cloud, not dark but insistent, because storms often begin as questions, and the question was simple and sharp. Who is she, that she could find calm where others only find rules and carts and safety cards and schedules? And who is he behind the gold and the headlines and the walls that money builds? And how did they both arrive at this thin silver road in the sky on the same morning, with the same lesson waiting just ahead? The attendant paused at the galley curtain and looked back once more to make sure the music still played in the boy's hands, and it did, and she nodded and turned to prepare a tray not of routine, but of little tools that build trust: a warm cup, a soft snack, a napkin folded like a tiny sail, a second paper card for drawing, and she balanced the tray as if it were a promise, and she knew the flight would test that promise, and that calm is not the absence of noise, but the strength to shape it. And outside the window the clouds opened into a corridor of sun, and the next chapter of the sky waited just beyond the wing whispers in the cabin. The jet leveled high above the land, and the engines kept their steady chant, while sunlight painted the cabin in a wash of gold, and the passengers began to settle into the rhythm of flight. But the earlier scene had already planted itself in their thoughts like a seed that would not stay. Buried in whispers began to travel seat to seat, drifting on the air faster than the service carts ever could. The woman in the red scarf leaned toward the businessman with the folded newspaper and whispered, almost under her breath, "Did you see how he started to shake before takeoff?" And the businessman shrugged as though the world had inconvenienced him, and he muttered, "Some people should not travel if they cannot handle it." But his words did not hide the glance he stole across the aisle, for he was curious. Like the rest of them, 2 rows behind the boy, a pair of teenagers shared a phone screen there, voices hushed with the thrill of secret recording, the lens catching only fragments of the boy clutching the puzzle sphere, and the young attendant kneeling beside him. And one teen whispered, "This could go viral," while the other frowned and whispered, "Maybe it is not right," and their conflict hummed in the space between them, unresolved. The father sat rigid in his seat, his hand resting on his son's arm, as though a simple touch could anchor him to calm waters, yet his eyes betrayed the weariness of a man who had fought this battle too many times in places where judgment fell heavier than compassion. His gaze scanned the cabin, and he caught the weight of strangers' stares, and for a heartbeat he wanted to rise and announce that his son was not broken but brilliant in a way the world did not measure, and yet the words stayed locked behind his teeth. The young attendant returned quietly, carrying the tray she had prepared, and placed a cup of warm tea for the father and a small box of crayons for the boy, and she whispered gently, "Would you like to draw the sky you are flying through?" And she placed another card with a blank horizon, and the boy lifted a crayon slowly, as if testing whether it was safe, and then he began to color. Lines of blue and streaks of yellow like lightning captured in a child's dream, and the passengers closest to the scene leaned slightly forward, caught between curiosity and discomfiting. The galley two attendants exchanged looks. One whispered, "She is going too far, this is not procedure," and the other shook his head and said, "Maybe, but look at the boy, he is calmer than before." And the debate hung unresolved, because procedure rarely bends until someone brave enough pushes against it, and even then the bending leaves ripples. The whispers grew into theories. Some passengers suggested the boy was spoiled by wealth, and others guessed he carried an illness hidden from sight, and still others softened their voices with sympathy, wondering how difficult it must be to travel when the sky itself could trigger storms within, and each whisper shaped the mood of the cabin like unseen currents. Tugging at the plane, the boy pressed his feet against the rolled blanket again and traced his drawing with the tip of his crayon, his lips moving with numbers no one else understood, and the young attendant crouched beside him again, pointing at the lines of blue and asking, "Is that the ocean or the sky?" And the boy replied softly, "Both." And his father blinked back sudden tears, because those were the first words his son had spoken since they left the ground. The businessman lowered his paper and cleared his throat as though reconsidering his earlier judgment, and the woman in the red scarf touched the edge of her seatbelt with restless fingers, no longer sure of her whispered opinion, and the teenagers put the phone face down on the tray table, feeling the weight of guilt heavier than the thrill of views. Further back, a mother with a baby on her lap, rocked gently and whispered to her child, "See, kindness is stronger than noise," and though the child could not understand the words, the rhythm of her voice carried the truth of them, and the baby cooed as if in agreement. Father leaned toward the attendant and whispered, "How did you know what to do?" And she replied with a steady calm, "I listen, I watch, and I remember that storms are only part of the sky." And the father closed his eyes for a moment, hearing wisdom in the simple words that years of wealth and influence had never purchased. As the plane cut through a patch of turbulence, the cabin jolted, and drinks rattled, and a few gasps escaped from passengers unprepared. But the boy tightened his grip on the puzzle sphere and pressed his feet harder into the blanket, and instead of a meltdown he let out a shaky breath and traced the spiral again and again on the card, and the young attendant whispered, "You are strong, the storm cannot move you and her." The voice was the thread that held him steady. Passengers who once whispered doubt, now whispered admiration, and the tide of judgment began to turn, though not fully, for judgment is a stubborn tide, but seeds of respect had been planted in soil once hardened by ignorance, and they waited for the next test to see if they would take root. The father rested his hand over his son's drawing and whispered, "Thank you again," his voice thick with emotions he rarely let surface in public, and the attendant smiled, not for praise but for the boy's calm, and she said, "We will face the sky one cloud at a time," and she stood slowly to resume her duties, leaving behind not silence but a softer air. Yet whispers never die so quickly, they linger and circle, and one passenger at the back whispered to another, "That girl is remarkable," and the reply came, "She should be promoted," and another whisper answered, "She is only doing what anyone should do," but the truth threaded through them all like an unseen current. She had done what few others dared to try, and in doing so she had reshaped the flight. And in the heart of the whispers sat the boy drawing his sky where blue met yellow and numbers danced like stars, and for the first time in many flights his storm was not the story, but the calm that followed became the whisper that mattered most. The engines droned on steady and strong, carrying them across the endless sky, while inside the cabin judgment gave way to curiosity, and curiosity bent toward compassion. And the next chapter of their journey waited just beyond the horizon with lessons no one yet imagined. The breaking point. The sky outside was calm, but inside the cabin a storm began to gather again, though no passenger could see its shape at first. It started with a small tremor in the boy's hands as he tried to hold the puzzle sphere steady, his thumb pressing harder against the shifting pieces, as if he wanted to lock the world in place. Yet the puzzle resisted him, and each slip of the pieces sent a shiver through his body like an echo of chaos. The father noticed first, his eyes darting to the small movements that spelled trouble. His voice leaned low, urging his son to breathe steady and count again, but the boy shook his head, his lips forming words too fast for breath to follow, and his body rocked in quick, uneven jolts that no longer matched the rhythm of calm they had built earlier. The crayons scattered from his lap to the floor and rolled beneath seats like little messengers of alarm. Passengers close by tensed, shoulders rising like waves, and whispers swelled again. One woman muttered, "Here it comes." Another clutched her armrest as if turbulence had returned, yet the plane itself glided smooth through clear air. The turbulence belonged only to the boy. The young attendant hurried from the galley, sensing the change before anyone called her. She moved with urgency, yet calmness clung to her. Every step she crouched again at the boy's side, speaking soft words about drawing spirals and counting stars, but the boy pressed both palms to his ears, shaking his head violently as if her voice was thunder instead of comfort, his breathing sharp and shallow as though the air itself had turned against him. The father reached to hold him steady, but the boy pulled away, curling against the window seat, his knees rising to his chest, and his voice broke into a high-pitched cry that cut through the cabin like glass shattering. The businessman groaned aloud, muttering that the flight would be unbearable now, and a passenger across the aisle pressed the call button repeatedly, as if noise were a crime in need of policing. The boy's cry rose higher, and passengers shifted uneasily, some covering ears, others glaring with impatience. Children peeked over seatbacks, wide-eyed, and parents pulled them back gently. The whispers grew sharp. "He should be sedated. Why does the father not control him? Should the captain intervene?" The cabin air thickened with judgment and fear. The father's face was pale with helplessness, his mouth working to form soothing words, yet his son's cries drowned them out, and his eyes begged silently for guidance from anyone who could anchor them. To calm, the attendant placed her hand lightly on the armrest near the boy, careful not to touch him, and she whispered to the father, "Let me try one more way." But her own voice wavered, because she felt the weight of all eyes pressing down. She lowered herself until she was nearly level with the boy, curled tight against the window, and instead of speaking, she picked up one of the scattered crayons and began to draw on the card again, not spirals this time, but waves, long sweeping lines rising and falling across the paper. She drew slowly and without words, and let the motion itself carry meaning. After a moment, she slid the card near him and tapped twice gently, not on him but on the tray table, and waited. The boy's cries stuttered just slightly, his eyes flickering toward the sound, and then back to the puzzle sphere still clenched in his hand, and then to the waves on the card. His rocking slowed half a beat, though the sobs still shook his chest. The attendant whispered now in the faintest breath, "These are the waves of the sea, strong and endless, and you are the boat riding them safe and steady." He pressed his forehead against the window glass, breathing fog onto the pane, his hand trembling around the sphere, and he whispered, "No boat will sink." And she answered without pause, "No boat will sink, not while I am here." And the father repeated softly, "Not while I am here either." And for a heartbeat the storm faltered, but storms rarely end so quickly. A child a few rows back laughed at a cartoon on a screen. The sudden burst of sound pierced the fragile calm, and the boy's cries surged again, his fists striking against the seat in front of him, and the passenger seated there twisted angrily, glaring over the headrest, muttering about spoiled children and lack of discipline. The father stood quickly, placing himself between his son and the angry glare, his voice sharp enough to silence the passenger, but not enough to silence the boy behind him. He crouched again, his hand hovering helplessly over his son, and his voice cracked with desperation, my boy, please come back to me." The attendant pressed the headset into the boy's hands, once more tapping the side in rhythm, and this time she whispered not to him but to the entire cabin, "Please give him a moment. No sudden noises, no sharp voices. Let the storm pass quietly." She spoke with authority, not found in training manuals but born of necessity, and for the first time the cabin obeyed. The businessman lowered his paper fully at last, his face softened by something he did not admit, even to himself. The woman in the red scarf placed her phone away, as though ashamed. The teenagers who once thought of recording now whispered that they should delete the clip before anyone saw it. The cabin grew quieter than any flight normally could. The boy clutched the headset to his ears and twisted the puzzle sphere wildly until a piece locked into place with a satisfying click. The sound startled him, and he froze, his breath caught, then released in a shudder. He pressed the sphere to his chest like a heartbeat and whispered numbers under his breath, slow enough this time for the father to understand. The father repeated the numbers softly back to him, each one like a lifeline tossed across a storm. The boy looked at him, eyes wet and wide, and for the first time since boarding, the cries broke into silent sobs, softer, weaker, but filled with release. The father gathered his son against his chest, and this time the boy did not pull away. He pressed close, trembling but quiet at the sound now of waves retreating from shore rather than crashing against it. The attendant remained crouched near them, her hands steady on the tray table, her presence like an anchor. The passengers breathed out slowly together, as though they too had been holding storms inside them and now released them in unison. The father looked up at her eyes, glistening with gratitude. He could not speak yet. The look said more than words, and she nodded as if to say, "The storm is not over, but the worst of the breaking point has passed, and for now he is safe." The engines hummed on above. The whispers now turned into silence. The plane soared through the wide sky, yet inside everyone felt the weight of what they had witnessed, a boy's storm, the breaking point of judgment, and the fragile thread of compassion holding them all together for the first time on the journey. And though the storm within the boy was not gone, the moment of raw breaking had forced the cabin to see him, not as noise but as a child fighting an invisible battle, and the young attendant knew this was only the middle of their flight, the hardest part yet to come, and the lesson waiting to unfold just beyond the clouds. The attendant's steps in the cabin had grown quieter after the storm of cries, but the silence was fragile, like glass stretched thin across a frame. One sound could shatter it again, and everyone seemed to know it. The father held his son against his chest, rocking gently, whispering numbers that had become like ropes, pulling the boy back from the edge, yet the boy's body still trembled as though every muscle was ready to break again at the smallest ripple. And that was when the young attendant knew she could not just soothe the storm, she had to change its course. She knelt again at their side, her knees pressing against the carpet and the hum of the engines beneath her like a drumbeat steady and grounding. She did not speak immediately, for words could be like stones thrown into water, making ripples that spread too far. She watched the boy's eyes darting around the cabin as if searching for escape routes, and she lowered her voice into the softest calm. I am here, and I will stay here until you feel safe. You do not have to hide, and you do not have to fight alone. The father looked at her as though he could not believe her courage, because already some passengers were muttering that she was neglecting her duties, yet she did not rise. She remained with the boy because in that moment there was no greater duty than anchoring a child who was drowning in his own sky. She pulled from her apron a small napkin folded like a sail, and she placed it gently on the tray table in front of him. She picked up a straw from the drink service and stood it upright in the napkin as though it were the mast of a tiny ship, and she said, "This ship will carry you across the sea of noise, and I will be the wind that pushes it forward. You can hold the ship if you want, or you can just watch it travel across the waves." The boy blinked through his tears, his hands loosening from the puzzle sphere just long enough to touch the edge of the napkin ship. He traced the fold with one trembling finger and whispered a number under his breath. The attendant whispered the same number back, and for the first time his lips curled into the faintest, almost invisible smile, like a crack of sunlight through heavy clouds. Passengers leaned closer without realizing they were leaning, curiosity stronger than annoyance. Now the businessman lowered his gaze, pretending not to watch, but his hand rested quietly on his armrest instead of drumming. Impatiently, the woman in the red scarf shifted uncomfortably, as though the weight of her earlier whispers pressed against her conscience. The teenagers no longer thought of recording. Instead, they exchanged a look of awe, as though something bigger than entertainment was unfolding before them. The father's shoulders lowered slightly, the exhaustion still heavy on him, but now replaced with something that looked like hope, and he whispered, "How do you know what to do?" And she answered, "I do not know everything, but I know that storms need harbors, and sometimes I can be one." And he closed his eyes for a moment, because he had never heard anyone speak of his son that way, not as a problem, not as a burden, but as a storm that needed a harbor. The boy picked up the ship in both hands and set it down again on the tray, repeating the movement like the rise and fall of waves. The attendant watched and matched her, breathing to his rhythm. "Steady inhale, steady exhale," she whispered. "You are the captain, and the ship will follow your calm." And the boy's breath began to slow, in time with hers, but calm never comes without challenge for a child. A few rows behind dropped a toy with a clatter that echoed louder than it should have. The boy flinched violently, his grip on the ship faltering, his breath catching sharp. But before the panic could take him, the attendant placed her hand firmly on the table, not on him but close enough to show presence, and said, "That was just thunder outside. Our tent and tents do not fall when thunder speaks." Her certainty steadied him, and he clutched the ship tighter, whispering, "No tent will fall." And she repeated with strength, "No tent will fall while you are inside." The father's throat tightened at the words, and he pressed his forehead gently to his son's hair, whispering the same promise, and the boy's body leaned into him, no longer stiff with fight, but seeking comfort willingly. For the first time from the back galley, another attendant whispered to the captain over the phone about the situation, but the captain answered firmly, "Let her handle it. I trust her judgment." And that trust spread quietly through the crew, even those who doubted earlier, for leadership is sometimes shown not by rank but by presence in the sounder. Boy traced another number on the tray table with his finger, and the attendant mirrored the number on her palm, holding it where he could see, and then she turned her hand and let the number drift away, as if carried on the wind. She whispered, "Numbers can be like birds. They fly, but they come back when you call them." And the boy repeated the number once more, his voice steadier than before. The cabin air shifted like a tired passengers who once whispered judgment now whispered admiration. One man murmured to his seatmate, "She has more patience than most of us could ever find." Another whispered, "I have never seen anyone calm a storm like that." And even those who said nothing felt the weight of their own silence. The boy finally leaned back into his seat, his breathing still uneven but no longer frantic, his hands loosening from fists to open palms resting against the puzzle sphere and the tiny napkin ship. He stared out the window at the endless stretch of clouds and whispered, "Are we still flying?" And the attendant smiled softly, "Yes, we are flying steady and strong, and you are part of the sky now." The father turned to her, eyes wet with gratitude, and whispered, "You saved him." And she shook her head gently and said, "He saved Himself I only reminded him how, and those words struck the father like truth, so deep he could not answer the attendant rose slowly, stretching her legs, but not stepping far. She lingered within sight, keeping her presence a steady lighthouse, and the boy's gaze followed her only briefly before returning to his ship and his puzzle and the drawing of waves. The storm had not disappeared, but it had been reshaped into something bearable. Passengers shifted back into their routines, but the air was not the same as before. It carried a softness, a respect, a recognition that they had all witnessed something rare and humbling. The engines droned on their steady song, and the sky outside remained wide and endless. But inside the cabin, hearts had shifted perspective, and as the boy traced spirals on his paper again, whispering numbers like prayers, the young attendant knew this was not just about calming one child. This was about teaching an entire cabin the strength of compassion, and the truth that even the fiercest storms can find safe passage when someone dares to step in. And so the flight continued, carrying not only people across the sky, but carrying a lesson etched into every whisper and every glance, that kindness is the only anchor strong enough to steady the breaking seas of the human heart. Tears and truths. The flight pressed on above the patchwork of clouds, and the boy's body rested softer now, though his eyes still flicked nervously from window to tray, to puzzle sphere, as though he feared any one of them might betray him. The father kept close, one arm still wrapped protectively around his son, as though if he loosened even a fraction, the boy might be swept away by another storm. The cabin had fallen into a heavy hush, yet beneath the hush a deeper current moved, because all who had witnessed the breaking point were still carrying its weight inside them. The young attendant returned again, this time carrying nothing but her calm. She lowered herself into the aisle and crouched near the boy once more, asking softly, "Would you like to draw again, or would you like to talk about the waves?" The boy hesitated, his lip caught between his teeth, and his fingers drumming lightly against the puzzle sphere. Then he whispered a word so fragile the father barely heard it, afraid the word would break in the air if spoken to. Loudly he whispered, afraid. The father closed his eyes, pain washing over his face, as if he had been struck, because he knew the boy rarely spoke his feelings aloud. The attendant did not move closer, but she nodded, as though afraid had been the bravest words she had heard in all her years. She said, "The sky can feel big and loud. It can feel like it wants to swallow us. But here, inside this plane, we make our own sky, small and calm and safe." The boy glanced at her, still wary, still trembling, yet the honesty of his whisper seemed to have cracked open something deeper. He pressed the puzzle sphere into his lap and began to turn it with quick jerks, and then whispered another word, "Mother," and the father's breath caught in his throat, his head bowing as though struck by invisible weight, for he had not expected that word here, not in front of strangers, not on this flight. The attendant waited. She did not push. She let silence settle around them like a blanket, until the boy whispered again, "Mother is gone. She left in the night. She never came back." The words broke, uneven, raw, and the cabin around them held its breath, for though he spoke softly, the pain was louder than the engines. The father's hand trembled against his son's shoulder, and he whispered, "Son, you do not have to." And yet the boy pushed the words out, as if they had been caged too long. She left, and the dark came, and the thunder came, and the tent fell. "I thought it would fall forever." His voice cracked into sobs that shook his whole body, and passengers who once judged lowered their eyes, not from shame alone, but from the weight of witnessing truth. The father's tears slipped free then, silent, hot, and unhidden. He gathered his son close, rocking him gently, whispering, "You are safe, you are safe. No tent will fall again." But his own voice shook with grief. He had tried so hard to bury, and now could not contain. The attendant placed a folded blanket across their laps, not for warmth alone, but as a symbol of shelter. "A new tent that would not fall," she whispered softly to the boy. "This tent is strong, and it is yours, and mine, and your father's together. No storm can break it." The boy pressed his cheek against the blanket, his sobs still coming, but slower, steadier, like rain easing after lightning. The father kissed the top of his head, whispering again and again, "You are not alone." And though tears streamed down his face, there was strength in them, because they carried truth, not pretensel, across the cabin. Passengers shifted uncomfortably at first, not used to such raw honesty in public, but slowly the discomfort turned to quiet reverence. A mother in coach clutched her baby closer, whispering to herself, "Never let go." A businessman who had sneered earlier rubbed at his eyes as though something had fallen into them, but it was not dust, it was humility. The teenagers who had tried to record now deleted the clip without speaking, their hands trembling slightly from the heaviness of what they had witnessed. The attendant remained kneeling, her back aching but her resolve unshaken. She spoke gently to the boy. "You are brave for speaking what hurts. Most bravery is not loud, it is not fists or shouting. Bravery is what you did just now, letting the truth leave your chest so it no longer crushes you." The boy looked at her through watery eyes and whispered, "I am brave," and she smiled with tears in her own eyes. "Yes, you are brave," the father whispered too. "You are stronger than I ever knew," and his son leaned into him more fully, as though the words had built a bridge across years of distance. The boy's sobs slowed to soft hiccups, his hands clutching both the puzzle sphere and the edge of the blanket, as if both were anchors, one built of pieces, one built of care. The cabin seemed transformed by their truth, the air lighter than before, passengers no longer whispering judgment, but whispering prayers or blessings, or simply nothing at all, because sometimes silence is the most respectful witness. The engines hummed like a lullaby, and the plane rode smooth through the high corridors of the sky. The boy finally whispered, "I miss her," and the father whispered, "I miss her too," and tears fell fresh again, but softer this time, not the violent storm of earlier, but the steady release of rain feeding the earth. And the attendant whispered, "You will always carry her, but you are not alone. You are held by those who love you, and right now, love is holding you." Here the boy nodded slowly, his fingers turning the puzzle sphere once more, each click matching the rhythm of his breath, each breath steadier than the last. He whispered to his father, "Will she see me from the sky?" And the father's voice trembled as he said, "She sees you, she hears you, and she would be proud of how brave you are." The boy's eyes softened at that, and he looked out the window at the endless blue and whispered his mother, as if the clouds themselves could carry his greeting, and the cabin fell into the deepest silence. Yet not the silence of judgment, but the silence of awe at the honesty of a child's heart. The attendant rose slowly, her knees stiff but her spirit strong. She placed her hand briefly on the father's shoulder, not to intrude, but to remind him he too was not alone. He looked up at her with gratitude too heavy for words, and she nodded before stepping back to give them space. Yet she remained nearby, ready. If the storm rose again, the boy rested against his father, now quieter than he had been since the journey began, his tears drying though his eyes stayed red, his breathing steadying into a fragile peace. The father stroked his hair, whispering soft promises that this time the tent would never fall, and passengers who once wished for silence now sat grateful for the sound of healing, for it reminded them of something too often forgotten, that compassion is louder than judgment, and truth is heavier than annoyance. And so the flight carried on through skies vast and unbroken, but within the cabin a different journey was unfolding, a journey through grief and love, through storms and truths, and by the time the wheels would touch ground, every soul aboard would carry a piece of the lesson spoken not by power or wealth, but by the tears of a child, and the hands that dared to comfort him. The flight of change. The hours stretched forward with the steady hum of engines carrying the great body of the plane. Across an ocean of blue and white outside the windows, the clouds drifted like soft mountains, while inside the cabin the air felt different, no longer heavy with whispers of judgment, but carrying the quiet weight of something deeper. The boy rested now against his father's side, his small body exhausted from the storm of tears, yet calmer than before, his fingers still tracing the puzzle sphere, absent-mindedly as though the turning pieces held the rhythm of his heart. The father kept one arm wrapped around him, unwilling to let go, not because he feared another outburst, but because he had realized how long it had been since he had simply held his son without distraction or apology. The young attendant lingered nearby, her presence not intrusive but steady like a lighthouse. She moved through her duties, serving drinks, refilling cups, answering questions, but her eyes always flickered back to the father and son, as though tethered by invisible thread. Passengers who earlier had muttered complaints now spoke softly when they asked for something, and some offered quiet nods of respect when she passed, for they knew they had seen something rare, not part of any training manual, not written into the script of customer service, but carved from patience and human compassion. The businessman who had folded his newspaper earlier now kept it shut on his lap, untouched, his thoughts turned inward, replaying the scene over and over. He thought of his own daughter, grown and living far away, and he felt guilt for the times he had dismissed her struggles as inconveniences. His hardened expression softened, and when the attendant passed he whispered, "Thank you," without explaining why. The woman in the red scarf adjusted her seatbelt and wiped her eyes when no one was watching, remembering her brother, who had struggled in silence while she judged too quickly, and she whispered a prayer under her breath asking for forgiveness for all the moments she had not shown kindness. The teenagers, who once saw only content for a screen, now stared at the boy with a quiet admiration, whispering to each other about how brave he had been, and promising not to waste the moment by turning it into views. The father finally leaned back his shoulders, no longer as rigid, his voice low when he whispered to the attendant across the aisle, "You have given me something. Money never could. Peace, even if only for this moment." She shook her head gently and replied, "You already had the peace inside you both. You only needed someone to remind you." And he felt her words settle into him like seeds waiting for soil. The boy stirred and lifted his head, eyes still red but steady. He whispered softly, "Are we almost there?" And his father nodded, "Yes, almost there." The boy looked at the attendant and whispered, "Thank you," his voice trembling but clear. She crouched once more so her eyes met his and said, "You do not have to thank me. You taught all of us today that storms do not make you weak. They show how strong you can be." The boy blinked at her words, and for the first time since boarding his lips curved into a true smile, small and fragile, but real. Final announcement came from the captain, the descent beginning, the flight nearing its end. The seatbelt sign chimed and passengers adjusted themselves. The world outside tilting as the nose of the plane dipped toward the earth, and yet inside the cabin no one thought of schedules or meetings or destinations. They thought only of the journey they had shared together and the lesson carried through a stone. The boy gripped his father's hand tightly as the plane began to lower, the engines shifting in tone and the ground growing closer. Through the window he whispered, "Will the landing be loud?" The attendant nodded honestly, "Yes, it will, but we will land together, and your tent will not fall." He nodded, holding tighter, and when the wheels touched the runway with a jolt, his body tensed at first, but then relaxed against his father because the promise had been kept. The tent had not fallen. The plane slowed to a crawl, lights flickering across the runway. Passengers began to collect belongings, but not with the usual rush. Many lingered in their seats, their eyes still drifting to the boy and the attendant, as though reluctant to break the spell of the moment. When the door opened and the first passengers began to leave, some paused to whisper words to the father. "You are strong, your son is brave, you are not alone." He nodded each time, gratitude spilling silently from his eyes. When it was their turn to leave, the father rose with his son still close at his side, the puzzle sphere in one hand, the small napkin ship folded carefully in the other, as though carrying treasure. He paused at the doorway, turning to the young attendant, his voice steady though thick with emotion. He said, "You did more for us in this flight than I can explain. You saw him when so many only see noise, and because of you, I will never look at him the same again." She bowed her head slightly and replied, "I only gave what every soul deserves, to be seen and to be saved." The boy tugged gently at her sleeve. Before stepping out, he whispered, "Goodbye, captain of the tent," and she bent low, her eyes shining, and whispered, "Goodbye, captain of the sky." They walked down the jet bridge into the waiting world, and though the father was still a billionaire, with wealth and power at his command, in that moment he knew his greatest treasure was not his empire, but the fragile boy holding his hand, who had taught an entire cabin what it meant to face storms with bravery. The attendant watched them go, the hum of the engines fading behind her, and she breathed deeply of the still air, knowing she would carry this flight in her heart forever, not as a duty, not as an incident, but as a story of change whispered across strangers, bound together in the sky. And when she turned back into the emptying cabin, she felt taller, stronger, as though the sky itself had bent closer to acknowledge the truth she had witnessed. And so the flight that began with whispers of judgment ended with whispers of respect. The boy had faced his storm, the father had faced his grief, the attendant had faced the weight of eyes and had chosen compassion, and the passengers had faced their own silence and learned the power of empathy. The engines cooled the cabin, emptied the runway, stretched wide into the distance. Yet the lesson remained unbroken. Storms will come, but tents can be rebuilt, hearts can be steadied, and kindness can change the course of any journey. The end.